In 1995, a research team in New Zealand finished a count they had been dreading. The number came back final: 51. That was every single bird of its kind left on Earth. A parrot, flightless, nocturnal, a species older than most mammals walking the planet today. So the government did something almost no one heard about. They moved every last one, by boat, by helicopter, in total secrecy, to islands most New Zealanders couldn't even name. Then they waited. 30 years passed. What happened next is now studied by conservationists around the world. The kakapo should never have been vulnerable. For thousands of years, it ruled the forest floor of New Zealand. No mammals hunted there, no claws in the dark, so the kakapo never learned to run. When danger came near, it simply froze. It trusted its moss-green feathers to make it disappear. That instinct worked for centuries. Then ships arrived, and with them came stoats, rats, and cats, predators the kakapo had no defense against. A New Zealand naturalist named Richard Henry saw the danger early. In the 1890s, he rowed hundreds of kakapo, one exhausting trip at a time, to a remote island meant to keep them safe. He believed he had saved them. He hadn't. A single stoat swam across the channel. Within a few short years, the birds on that island were gone. By the 1970s, most scientists quietly accepted the kakapo was extinct. Then, in 1977, a search team pushed into the dense forests of Stewart Island. They found droppings, feeding marks, a deep booming call at night unlike anything recorded before.
The kakapo was alive, but when researchers finally counted every bird they could locate, their relief collapsed into something else entirely. Almost all of them were male. A skewed sex ratio wasn't the only problem. The remaining kakapo were scattered, aging, and isolated from each other by miles of untouched forest. Breeding wasn't happening, and nobody fully understood why at first. Then, researchers discovered something strange about the species. Kakapo only breed in years when a specific native tree, the rimu, produces a heavy fruit crop. That happens once every 2 to 4 years, sometimes longer. The entire future of the species depended on a tree's unpredictable cycle, something no scientist could control or schedule. By 1995, the New Zealand Department of Conservation made a decision that stunned even some of their own staff. Every surviving kakapo, all 51 of them, would be moved, not to a sanctuary on the mainland, not to a zoo, to remote, predator-free islands most New Zealanders had never set foot on. Codfish Island, Little Barrier Island, places stripped of every rat, stoat, and cat through years of brutal eradication work. Helicopters were chartered. Each bird was caught, weighed, and individually named by the recovery team. One man, a senior ranger who had spent over a decade tracking the species, later admitted he didn't expect most of them to survive the transition. Then, during the very first breeding season on the islands, something happened that no one had predicted. The first signs were small, a handful of eggs, then a handful of chicks that actually survived to adulthood, something that hadn't happened reliably in over a decade. Rangers began supplementary feeding the females during lean years, carefully timing nutrition to encourage breeding even when the rimu trees failed to fruit. It worked better than anyone expected. By the early 2000s, the population had climbed past 80. Researchers started tracking every individual bird by name, logging weight, location, and breeding history in a shared database used across the entire program. One chick, hand-raised after a respiratory illness as an infant, became so imprinted on humans that he would later approach researchers directly, completely unafraid. The population kept climbing, past 100, past 150. Then, in 2019, on Vanuatu, one of the most carefully guarded islands in the entire program, a fungal infection called aspergillosis began spreading through the kakapo population. It killed birds the recovery team had protected for over 20 years. Rangers worked around the clock, treating infected birds by hand, isolating others, racing against an outbreak no one had fully anticipated. For a few terrifying weeks, decades of progress hung in the balance. And just as the population was approaching a number nobody had seen in over a century, it looked like everything could collapse again. The outbreak was contained. Veterinary teams treated every infected bird by hand, some receiving antifungal medication for weeks before showing any sign of recovery. Most survived. And that same year, 2019, turned out to be something the recovery team hadn't anticipated either. A massive Rimu fruiting event swept across the islands, the most productive breeding season ever recorded for the species. 86 chicks hatched in a single season. By the end of 2019, the kakapo population crossed 200 for the first time in over 100 years. By 2022, official counts placed the number above 250, 252 to be exact, each one individually named, tracked, and known to the researchers who had spent careers protecting them. 51 birds moved in secrecy to islands most of the country couldn't name. 30 years of feeding, treating, relocating, and waiting on a tree's unpredictable cycle. And somehow, against odds that once looked close to zero, the species held on. The kakapo is still critically endangered. It still cannot fly. It still depends entirely on human intervention to survive, but it is no longer disappearing. Today, conservationists from other countries study the kakapo program as a model for what intensive, patient, decades-long recovery work can actually achieve. Sometimes saving a species isn't a single dramatic moment. It's 51 birds and 30 years of someone refusing to let go. If stories like this are worth your time, stick around. There are more of them here.